Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson.
Hello and welcome back to the Hospopreneurs Podcast. The story of Angel's Envy reflects bourbon's evolution in modern America. Master distiller Owen Martin sits down to discuss the practical challenges and rewards of pushing the boundaries of bourbon through secondary finishing. This interview with Owen is about challenging traditions and finding excellence in the unexplored corners of whiskey craftsmanship. Hello and welcome to the show, Owen.
Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program. It's been a little while since we caught up in Melbourne, back at Pearl Diver. You had an event there not too long ago, but from our little catch-up before the interview, it sounds like you've done some pretty incredible things, launching all over the world and meeting many people. I'm excited to sit down with you today and ask you the questions for the program. I've got some specific questions for you too, and I'm excited to open all that up with you. So thank you for sitting down with me today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Oh, and as you know, the first question that I like to ask on the show is a crazy hospitality story or exceptional hospitality experience. I'd love to know what you have for the show today.
Yeah, I guess my background is more as a pure production person. And so I think getting into the industry, getting into the spirits industry, I didn't really realize the hospitality aspect of it until a few years in. I think good examples are any sort of hospitality around a spirits launch, both in the last company I worked for or this one. The last company I worked for, there was people lining up for a week before release. Since being in Kentucky, I've realized just the incredible level of hospitality that comes along with the bourbon industry here. Obviously, we're sort of competing with the people around us, but it's also sort of a rising tide lifting all ships scenario where we want to have the best hospitality. We want our neighbors to, and so that people are encouraged to come to Kentucky and really experience the whole thing.
It's interesting hearing the way that you describe that there is the competition is about one-upping others in how much hospitality you provide, which is quite an interesting way to look at it. Now, I've not been to Kentucky, but it sounds like a really interesting place. I know many have, of course. It's a very well-known destination for whiskey lovers, and certainly a lot of listeners will have been there before. I'd like to know, though, what it is that's really driving you. What is it that inspires you to do what you do every day? Because it usually sort of leads on from this first question that I ask about a crazy story. It doesn't always, but a crazy story or exceptional experience often I find influences why people do what they do, why they're in the industry that we're in. I'd love to know what it is that really inspires you.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think as a hospitality parallel. I guess you want to deliver the best experience, oftentimes in the form of a cocktail or that sort of thing. For me, I guess it would be a similar mindset of always putting the best possible liquid in the bottle that I can. Obviously, easy one there in quality, like is it exceptional liquid, but also is it pushing the boundaries? Is it delivering an experience someone may not have had before? Both like a cast finish that may have not been used or is not widely used, or just a combination of flavors that catches people by surprise, but always wanting to do that in a way that's natural, authentic, and cohesive in its character. So I guess that's kind of the overarching motivation, is that I'm probably overly particular or meticulous with blending and making sure that at the end of the day, I'm proud of what's in the glass and what's in the bottle.
What is it, though, that excites you about that?
It's sort of touching on that. It's pushing the boundaries. I don't want to just make the same thing that's been made over and over again for decades or hundreds of years. It's always fun when you can make a nod towards the historical aspect of bourbon or American whiskey or whiskey more broadly. But to me, it's continuing to kind of innovate and push the boundaries and push us forward.
So talk to me then about some of the things that you're doing now. You know, you are pushing things forward. You are doing some things differently. Talk to me about some of those things that you are doing.
Yeah. So Angel's Envy's going on about 15 years old, so fairly young in terms of American whiskey or bourbon producers. And it, from its inception, has always been a cast finished product line. So cask finishing by that just means taking mature bourbon, for us typically around 5 years old, and then putting it into a barrel that held something else. Could be wine, often port wine is our flagship release, but other types of wine, other spirits such as rum. And so, often what I'm working on is looking at different cask finishes that we haven't done before and seeing how those can be applied for special releases or maybe more widely for like a national release. Actually, we did a really fun one back in June, and we just did a second release of it, bottled it yesterday, actually, which was what's called a bottle and bond whiskey, which is a very historic designation in U.S. terms. So it's from 1897. It actually predates bourbon even having a definition. So like I said a minute ago, this was a way for us to nod to the historic aspect of bourbon. But of course, we wanted to do it with our own spin on it, do it in our own way. And so what was kind of a milestone is the first time a bottle and bond had ever been done at cask strength or barrel proof. So basically we were able to blend to hit 50% ABV on the dot, which is one of the stipulations behind the bottle and bond designation. And so for the first time, we were able to combine these kind of two different concepts, which was one being bottle and bond, which is, again, very historic, and then the newer one being cask strength, which is a very popular thing in the U.S. at the moment, or has been for the last few years.
So in that innovative pursuit, I want to actually take us back to the origin of your work in the industry, because you've done a lot of work in the industry to lead you to where you are.
Yes.
Tell me about that and the evolution that took place to bring you to where you are now.
Sure. Well, I think a joke, if people look at my resume, it seems like there's all been a grand plan, but really it's just a series of pivots and kind of taking whatever opportunities are present in the moment. So yeah, to go all the way back, I'm an engineer by degree. So did a degree in mechanical engineering. I actually did a semester at the University of Newcastle during my undergraduate down in Australia. But even by the time I was getting towards the end of that degree, I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want a desk job. I wanted to, apply myself more creatively, and then kind of on the hospitality angle, do something that engaged with people. So at that point, I was homebrewing quite a bit, and my idea was to pivot from engineering into beer. At the time, I think in retrospect now, this was sort of where craft beer had peaked in the US. And so when I was looking at brewing schools, they were waitlisted often by a year or more. They were very expensive, and ultimately they were just certificates. So I kept kind of seeing what was out there. And again, having lived abroad briefly in Australia, that was on my mind that maybe I could look at international programs in brewing. And sure enough, I found one in Scotland that was an actual master's degree. You had to have a technical undergraduate to apply. So it felt like I was still sort of on the path and still using my undergraduate. And it was, a master's degree in brewing and distilling science. So packed up, moved to Scotland with the intention of formalizing the home brewing into a career. But even in the course of living in Scotland, took another pivot from beer into whiskey because, again, the first half of the course was beer, second half was whiskey. And so that kind of caught my attention as continuing to layer on this knowledge. And then also, just living in Scotland and drinking a fair bit of scotch, I really got passionate and interested in the production of whiskey. So
what was it about whiskey? Like, what was it that made you shift your interest?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there was a few reasons. I mean, there's I hate to say it, but almost the economical decision of, again, this was a very popular time in craft beer. There is a lot of brewers popping up all over the place. And meanwhile, I think it felt like I was a little bit more specialized if I was going to go down the whiskey path. So moving back to the US, that would kind of separate me in a better way. But beyond that, I think I was really interested that, you can pop a nice bottle of beer, a nice bottle of wine, and you can open that and share it. In the case of the wine, maybe you can plug it back up and drink it over the course of a few days. But I really liked that with whiskey, it wasn't something that you needed to drink immediately. I guess an example being that you could open a nice bottle and that you just have a pour of that bottle with your family every holiday time, right? Like something very, very special that's very memorable that provides that experience. And so I liked that when I was making these whiskeys and learning how to make these whiskeys, that they were sort of a snapshot in time, but one that could be revisited over and over again.
Amazing. Okay, so you're in Scotland, you're learning, you're doing your master's, you're learning so much more about whiskey, and you're starting to develop an interest in whiskey. Tell me then what happens from there.
Yeah, okay. So I did my master's thesis in conjunction with a lowlands distillery. So I was never employed by a Scotch distillery, but I was still at that point thinking I would use my engineering degree to some extent. And so my master's thesis was a joint project between the engineering and the distilling departments of the university called Harriet Watt. So basically I was taking distillation byproducts and trying to isolate nutrients out of them. So a kind of very technical, nerdy side of things that wasn't really directly involved in whiskey production. But again, it was the slow transition from engineering fully into just becoming a whiskey distiller and blender. So completed that. But then when I moved back to the States, basically dove full blown into whiskey production, right? So not really engineering, so to speak, but in the fermentation, the distillation, the barrel aging, especially the maturation aspects. And so, I moved straight to a very small craft distillery. We made about 10 barrels of bourbon a week. So in my mind, that was kind of a neat way to really bring the course full circle. Obviously, there was practical aspects of the course, but this was really, in my mind, kind of almost the second piece of it was putting everything I'd learned in Scotland into practical application day after day after day, right? And especially when you work for a small startup, you're really wearing every hat. So like I would mash and ferment and distill during the day. And then as soon as afternoon hit, we'd have volunteers come and we'd bottle at least 2 or 3 times a week. So it was long days, but again, like really putting it into practice. After 2 years, actually a friend I had made in the course, another American who was in the Scottish course the year before me, kind of vouched for me. And he was working at a place in Colorado. And so they hired me. It was the biggest single malt distillery in the US. And so I moved over to Colorado, and over the course of about 7 years, kind of worked my way up from night distiller all the way to managing fermentation and then R&D, and then, eventually being the head distiller and production manager. So what I was doing there by the end, as in terms of R&D, was basically functioning as the blender, right? And doing a lot of cast finishing, doing a lot of blending of different cast finishes. And so that was kind of the parallel that then took me over to Angel's Envy, because as I mentioned, like it is really, I think, identified as the pioneer of cast finishing in the American whiskey space.
So you said that that's something that you carried with you. Tell me how you did that and then how it's influenced your work since.
The cast finishing and blending?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I would even take it back to Scotland, right? I think it's pretty commonly understood that the Scots invented cast finishing, maybe 80s, 90s. And so, I'd already sort of been immersed in that world. You think of like the Balvenie Doublewood and some of these vatted, blended released. So that was sort of the educational component. And then Colorado especially was really trialing that myself with different cast finishes and really, getting hands-on, getting the sensory information of what each cask imparted upon the malt whiskey. And so what I've carried through is sort of this library of cast finishes, different types of rum, tequila even, all these different types of fortified and dessert wines. But now, as opposed to my past where it was more applied to malt whiskey, now the application is towards the more traditional American whiskey space of bourbon and rye.
You mentioned you have a library in your mind of these sorts of different cask finished flavors or profiles that you've just got that you now carry with you. Tell me about some that might be standing out in your mind as innovative, things that are possibly coming in the future, whether that's through your business or through others that you've seen that are just really interesting that you think may have an opportunity down the track.
Yeah, I think it's worth backing up to say that, 14 years ago when Angel's Envy started, again, it was a pretty blank space in the US, but it really had not been applied to bourbon. And so, we led in with a ruby port finish, and it was pretty, I honestly want to say, controversial at the time, right? Because again, bourbon is a very traditional space and cast finishing had not ever been applied to it, at least not at scale like we were. And so that was really pushing the boundaries at the time. But I think the proof that Angel's Envy was onto something is that especially now in the US, if you go to a large liquor store, you'll see 50 to 100 cast finished bourbons there. And I only note that because now it's a somewhat crowded space. So if we're talking about a new finish, odds are a lot of times it's been done. Even in the course of our history, we've done a lot of the different fortified wine barrels. And so some of the white space that I see out there is now in the combination of finishes. So, and one example is about a year ago, we came out with a cast finish rye at cast strength, but it was actually a blend of Sauterne finished rye. So again, a sweeter dessert wine, and then toasted oak barrel. So much in the American sense of maturing the bourbon in a new oak barrel, it was then finished in a second toasted oak barrel. And so the sweet wine providing much more of the desserty aspect, the toasted barrel providing some more of that oaked and the structure and the tannin, while still having some sweetness to it, and then basically layering those two profiles upon each other. And so, again, in a space where a lot of finishes have already been done now, that's kind of where I can see not only us, but whiskey producers in the U.S. being able to continue putting their own spin on things, because obviously if you're combining them, you're doing it in your own way, you're figuring out your own ratios. And so I think it's really how you can creatively make something unique in a world where a lot of these barrels have been used. But that being said, I mean, right now we're playing around with some tequila barrels, and I think it's kind of neat that they impart more of this like herbal spice character. So seeing how that plays with it. What else? I guess it goes to the broader idea of cask finishing, of what you're trying to do with that. And I think maybe, again, 10, 15 years ago, the purists would have said that cask finishing in the U.S. sense would be like covering up your base characteristics. But again, with my kind of background in Scotch and how ubiquitous cask finishing is there, my comment has always been that you cask finish to highlight characteristics of your base whiskey. So you can either layer and reinforce something, say like the fruitiness of a fermentation, you're reinforcing that with, like a wine barrel, or you can contrast that and take something that's maybe has a base fruity estery character and then apply a spice forward finishing cask. And so I think that's where I continue to see us and how I want to make whiskeys going forward is being very intentional with what finishing casks we're using, not just using them to be the first to do it, but doing it in a way that is very flavor driven. And then, again, pushing the category where we do see the opportunities to do that, either in casks that maybe have been less used or, again, the combination of casks in novel ways.
If we take a minor step, like a half step back and look at innovation still, tell me about some other things, other innovative techniques or processes that you've seen in the industry.
Sure. Well, I would say even not in the industry. Like when I look at the word finishing or just the idea of a finishing process, so often that's just applied to the idea of a cask. But I do think there's innovative ways we can finish whiskey and what we can learn from other industries. And one of the ones I like to bring up that I've not used before, but I plan on hopefully doing some experiments in the next, 6 months or so, is cognac. I think the cognac industry does some interesting things with how they prepare the final cognac. And by that, I mean, it starts as a higher ABV spirit in the barrel. But as they lose evaporative losses out of the barrel, what's called angel share, which is also where we derive our name from, you're evaporating a certain percentage of alcohol and water out of your barrel every year. As a whiskey maker, that's a good thing, actually. We want that oxidative reactions to take place. We want that sort of ability to mature the whiskey that way. But what cognac does that's interesting is they then top their barrels up with water, right? So as they lose alcohol out of the barrel, then they have this headspace in the barrel and they add water to that. So, you call it cutting your whiskey, cutting your spirit, right? When we bottle something, we're often bottling it in the 40 to 50% ABV range, but in the barrel, it's often 60% or higher. So most producers across all spirit categories dump the spirit out of their barrel and then cut it with their water down to their bottling. But what I like about cognac is they do essentially what's called slow proofing or in-barrel proofing, where they add that water as it continues to mature. And, that's obviously very labor intensive. I don't see us propping a whole, day in, day out release on that. It's a space I'd like to explore for like a limited release, or maybe something that we end up finishing in a cognac barrel, right? So that we have that sort of continuity of process and flavor. And so, I guess long story short, I think there's processes we can learn from outside our industry that can be applied to bourbon in ways that are, again, authentic, but surprising to our audience.
That's really interesting. And I've not heard of that process before. Some listeners may be well aware of that, but and some may not. But I've not heard of that process before. So it's very interesting. The first thing that I think with that is, does that mean that the flavor of cognac is less ingrained in the barrel as a result of it being diluted?
Yeah, I think it's just a different climate for one, right? A lot of these cognac barrels are in cellars, like in caves essentially, and so they mature very differently than a barrel would in Kentucky, say. And by that, we lose probably 2 to 3 times more out of the barrel evaporatively than they do. We have a much more, I guess you could call their process a little bit more mellow of a maturation. But I think the water and the slow proof sort of accentuates that, where in Kentucky, 1 being a new barrel, 2 being a hotter environment, we're going to pull a lot more oak forward spirit. And then the lower proof that they encounter in cognac, and then the more humid, cool environment that they're maturing in kind of all works together to create a more mellow and less oak forward spirit. Not to say one's right or wrong. It's just, that really goes back to the basis of any spirit, and it's sort of reflection of the terroir and environment that it's made in.
We do obviously have a bit of background noise in the episode today. Owen, do you want to tell us what's actually going on at the distillery there?
Sure. Well, I guess it's good evidence that I actually am working in a distillery, but I believe what's going on is we are unloading a lot of barrels, a shipment of barrels. So we'll fill about 125 bourbon barrels, about 200-liter barrels a day. And so those shipments, those trucks will show up a couple times through the day, and they got to be unloaded. So unfortunately, my office, or fortunately, my office is kind of right in the production area. That's kind of the day-to-day, is the different clanking and bonking sounds of a distillery. And unfortunately, sometimes that comes through on the interviews. But again, hey, it's a proof that this is an authentic, actual bourbon distillery.
A few more barrels than you mentioned you were doing a week earlier. You were saying 10 a week.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I think, like I said, first place I worked when I moved back to the States was 10 barrels a week. So incredibly hands-on, very much in the craft spirits movement days. And then, as I said, I worked at the largest single malt distillery in the US, which is still very, very small by comparison to bourbon. And so we were making about 80 barrels a week. And then you can definitely see the scale of a Kentucky distillery, where 125 a day is still relatively small in Kentucky terms, right? Which to me, jumping in was definitely a order of magnitude bigger. But when you put it in terms of the major brands that most of your listeners have heard of, they can be filling 1,000 to 2,000 barrels every single day. So I actually really like it. Certainly, it felt like I jumped in the deep end when I first got here. But the more I've got my footing underneath me in Kentucky, I've realized that I can still take the exact same mindset I've always had, even at very, very small mom and pop distilleries, and still apply it to a global brand here in our craftsmanship.
In an earlier answer, you mentioned some of the adjacent, almost not quite industry. I mean, it is still in beverages, adjacent industries in the beverage industry, if I may use the word industry twice.
No, yeah.
I'd like to know more broadly, where do you look for inspiration in the work that you do, maybe outside of beverages?
That's an interesting question. I would say, let me address spirits briefly, and then I'll try to extend that to other industries. But where I'm at, I think, having described the background to you, because I like the idea of having a foot in production and a foot in sort of the branding and marketing side of things, right? And so, whereas production is very much science is science, it's going to, we mash at a certain temperature so that we can extract different enzymes. So the enzymes can convert starch to sugar, and we distill up to a certain ABV, right? Like, these are very rigorous numbers. So it's there's not a lot of creativity in there. But then the creative part of it is your grain bill. And then after maturation, as we've talked about, how you match flavors with finishing casks and how you produce what you want to produce. And then the storytelling that goes along with it. And so to me, to be in the role I'm in is sort of this span, as I said, between production and marketing, but even between science and artistry. So when I'm looking at other people outside of the industry altogether, those are the type of people I'm looking at, is who's doing things creatively, who's maybe taking a medium that existed in a certain thing like podcasting, right, and doing something completely new with that. And so those, maybe to paint in broad strokes, are where I like to look at just someone doing something creatively or taking an industry in a slightly different direction, and what I could maybe learn from them.
Do you have some examples of people that you've looked to, or brands?
Yeah, I grew up on NPR in the US, so public radio, and obviously This American Life is the famous one. Radio Lab, again, in the podcasting world. So people that were sort of telling stories in a way that hadn't been told before in a relatively new medium at that time. Obviously, podcasting's massive now. I guess in industry, I like to look at other companies, often smaller craft places, and what we can kind of learn from them as a larger distillery now. So one I always like to give a shout out to is a company called Compass Box. I think they did a really nice job in Scotland of sort of reclaiming blended Scotch as a high quality crafted item, whereas so often I think blended Scotch got thrown to the wayside as single malts got bigger and more, I guess, craftsmanship oriented. So again, anyone who's looking at maybe a category that isn't where it could be and seeing the potential in that category to lift it up.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing those as well. I'd like to ask you, in your work, and you touched on the analytical side versus the creative side. I'd like to focus a little bit more on the creative side. When you're going through that process of coming up with something new, how do you know whether you should go ahead with something or whether that idea is one to just let go?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I guess I'm always trying to think of a couple things in parallel. It's always flavor first. As I said off the bat in the show, it's how do I put the best whiskey in the bottle? But I don't think that's even sufficient at this point. Again, in a crowded marketplace, in a liquor store shelf that has many finished whiskeys now, I don't know that it's enough just to make a really, really good whiskey. You have to have the storytelling and the why that goes along with it. And so these are things that are always kind of, again, in parallel being thought about as we're making this whiskey or shaping this release. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to think of not only the finishing cask that I'm pairing the whiskey with, but maybe the storytelling that goes along with that. So, it could be small things, right? Like the tequila barrels I was telling you about, we're looking at maybe putting rye whiskey into them instead of bourbon and matching a more spicy base spirit with that spicier herbal finishing cask. So it could be as simple as that. We're looking at some other releases, hopefully sometime in about a year from now, that are really going to lean into local terroir, right? So the local water, the local grain, the local maturation environment that we were speaking of. I think if you're making the whiskey right, the storytelling kind of naturally comes along with it, but it's certainly something I don't want to neglect until the last minute.
Interesting hearing that you're thinking about that brand story in the creative process. And you certainly have to have a lot of experience to really come to that, to be thinking down the line, you're not really thinking about the commercial aspect generally at that point when you're playing with those ideas, when you're thinking, coming up with the product. The commercial side is this is the whole other end of the process, right? The value chain. So interesting to hear that you go through that, at least you're thinking of it when you're coming up with a product. It's quite interesting to hear that.
Yeah, and I think we get even take that back a step. I mean, I'm just pretty much exactly 2 years with the company right now. Really, despite the job title, pretty much everything I've done to date has been functioning as a blender, which you probably could tell from our conversation. But by that, I mean, I'm taking whiskey that predates me with the company, right? I told you 5-year bourbon is pretty much our mark right now for our standard flagship releases, and then putting it into a wine barrel for another 6 months, something like that. So clearly that was fermented, distilled, put down in a barrel before I walked in the door. But I love the idea of maybe another 5 years from now, you'll see the distilling side of it, right? So it's almost two parallel tracks of product development. One is taking existing whiskey and blending into releases. And meanwhile, the second and longer one is that when you use a new grain bill, use a new yeast strain, something like that, you have to start from day one. So that's clear spirit off the still that then goes into the barrel. That takes 5+ years to get to the initial maturation to then even put it in a finishing cask. And I think there'll be some really cool releases down the line where you can see that we conceptualized a grain bill or we used a specific yeast strain with the idea not only of what that whiskey or bourbon was going to be after maturation, but we already had in mind what kind of finishing cask we were going to put it in at the point that we even just conceived the product. So I'm excited to get to that point. Obviously, there's a lot of fun things between now and then, but that's where I see the end goal. And again, that level of intentionality with why we were tweaking the variables that we were tweaking.
In your process of creating anything, who do you look to for advice?
Well, so Angels Envy is a Bacardi-owned company. And so I got a little experience working with a parent company at the last distillery I worked at. This is definitely on a different scale. But it's been really lovely to touch base with other blenders and distillers of large companies within the Bacardi portfolio, right? So Patron, as you can imagine, I'm talking to a producer about tequila barrels. Dewar's is a large Scotch blending house in the portfolio. And so again, as somebody with more of a Scotch background and one who kind of takes that blending mentality into what I'm making here, it's really been lovely to touch base with the Scottish and Irish whiskey producers, because they're the ones who are cask finishing as well. So when I have an idea, oftentimes I can touch base with them. We try to do like a yearly roundtable where we taste some of the things we're working on. And so those sort of colleagues are where I find a lot of value in being able to just touch base on maybe ideas that I haven't even put into practice yet, but just an initial gut check on if they think this would work from their perspective.
What's some advice that you recall receiving from them? I'm trying to get some understanding of what that looks like, what those conversations really look like.
I mean, it's sort of a two-way street. So in the US, we've been more likely to use what's called specialty malt, right? So think about the type of malt you use to make a Guinness or like an amber ale, right? You've kilned it a little bit more. And so traditionally in Scotch and Irish whiskey, they're just using pale malt, right? Like the same stuff you'd make a lager out of, more or less. And so I think the US, with more of its craft whiskey and sort of innovation mindset, were early to use those. And now I think you're starting to see that flow through back to the more traditional industries that use malted barley. And so it's been interesting to touch base with them on that. But I mean, for advice from them, more often than not, it's in terms of finishing casks. And so like for us, right, by law, we can only use our first barrel once. That's a very unique aspect of bourbon and American whiskey, is that we have to use a freshly charred barrel or we cannot call it bourbon. And so basically what that means is once we're done and we empty that barrel, our hands are tied. We're not going to refill it. And so almost all these barrels flow from the US over into Europe, some amount to rum distilleries as well. But it's really been a one-way path, I would say, traditionally of barrels. But because Angels Envy is a somewhat innovative company in the finishing aspect, I'm now sort of asking for those barrels to come back. Now there's this better flow of barrels back and forth, and not a lot of whiskeys finished in Scotch and Irish barrels because they're typically a lighter profile. And if we're talking about American whiskeys being so oak forward, sometimes that wouldn't even come through. And so we had a lot of discussions of if we were to use or trial, these lighter profile barrels, how we might be able to make that work for us as American whiskey producers who are finishing.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. It's just really interesting to hear what that looks like, what that conversation sort of looks like, what that feels like to be there and having those conversations.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it depends on if the conversation's in person or not, but typically I think the most productive conversations are ones where we can actually pour the whiskeys we're making or we're working on, or even we're conceptualizing, and have that discussion with the liquid in front of us, because everyone's clearly very sensory focused. And I think that's where you can really get into the nuts and bolts of things, of why it has this fruity character, why it has a smoky character, and how you might, as we were talking about earlier, accentuate or contrast those. I find the most compelling conversations to be the ones where we can literally taste and talk about what we're trying to put into practice.
What's something that's really surprised you recently then?
Okay. Yeah, I would say, so there's a project I'm working on right now, and I'm hoping we can present it at this big bourbon industry-wide conference here in the spring. So there's a practice called, you basically sulfur your wine barrels, right? So when the wine producer has emptied their barrels, oftentimes they treat it with what's called a sulfur candle. And really that just is meant to essentially suck the oxygen out of the air of the barrel before it's shipped internationally. And the goal there being that no bacteria is growing in the barrel by the time it lands stateside. So that's a pretty common practice. And when done right, you get a barrel with, wine character, no spoilage. It's producers run into this where that sulfur character has become stronger than it should have and is now imparted in that barrel. And so it's a really sad thing when you take good bourbon or good American whiskey and you put it into a wine barrel expecting something to come out, and then you get surprised with this unfortunate matchstick character or eggy, or all these different, sulfur can express itself all these different ways. But this experiment I've been running is to it's sort of counterintuitive. It's to use finishing casks to strip character rather than add it. And by that I mean we've taken this sulfured whiskey now, and we're actually putting it back into ex-bourbon barrels. So the bourbon barrels that we would typically be shipping to Scotland or Ireland that I was just discussing. But because the bourbon barrels have a charred layer to it, right? They've been lit on fire as opposed to the toasted wine barrels. That char layer can actually scrub some of that sulfur out. So like when you hear that, vodkas are like 10 times charcoal filtered, that sort of thing. Really, same idea is happening inside the whiskey barrel. And we've actually had some really good luck removing that sulfur character by putting it back into essentially the original barrel it came out of. So right now I'm waiting on some data to come back, and I'm hoping I can present that in a few months.
That's interesting. What sort of data are you getting in the process? Like, how do you test those sorts of things?
I'm not the lab analytical guy, but I'm very lucky to have a pretty high caliber lab here. So they'll run it through what's called a GC analysis or gas chromatography, and that can actually quantify different compounds in your liquid, in your new make spirit and your aged spirit. And so we can literally see what the level of sulfur is, when we first encounter it. And then what we did was we pulled samples every couple of weeks throughout the summer, and we were able to see, or at least first results seemed to indicate we were able to see and quantify that sulfur level dropping week over week.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I've got a question that I've been asking a lot recently, just because I've seemed to get a whole range of different answers from it. I'd like to know, what is something specific that is very important to you, you believe is incredibly important, that maybe partners, maybe customers aren't likely to recognize or know about, right? Possibly even understand or appreciate. So something that you believe is valuable that's often overlooked.
Yeah, I think with the bourbon industry especially, or maybe I'd say broadly more the American industry, I feel like we've sort of started to cater to the very niche, nerdy subset. And so by that, I mean, we can take a nice bottle of beer, you can take a nice bottle of wine, you can pour that for someone who knows next to nothing about beer or wine, and they still find like a degree of approachability there, right? Whether that's a $200 bottle of wine or whatever. They might not recognize it being amazing, but I think they can kind of access it with their palate. So bourbon and American whiskey consumers have started to gravitate towards higher and higher ABV releases, often single barrels, as I said, like cask strength, that sort of thing. And so I think about it, I don't think this has really expressed itself in the same way amongst European whiskey consumers. They're less concerned with the ABV, more like age statement and what part of, say, Scotland it came from. And so although we love a nerdy whiskey consumer and someone who wants all the details and wants it straight out of the barrel at high strength, I think when I'm looking at what I want to put in the bottle, I like to think that I want to make something that can apply to that whiskey nerd, that one who wants it as high strength as I can get. But I also want to make something that inherently has balance to it and that can be treated in the same way as that beer or wine I gave as an example, that I could pour for, my mom and dad, and that they recognize a lot of craftsmanship went into that, even if maybe it's not their favorite thing in the world, but it's not going to be so high proof that it immediately turns 90% of consumers away from it. And so, even though that's maybe a trendy thing to market, high proof, cask strength, that sort of thing. I mean, we have a yearly cask strength release that's well received. In general, I think I put a lot of emphasis on myself that every bottle we make has to have this balance to it, that has to be a rounded profile, that isn't just punchy for the sake of being punchy or high proof or, a ton of oak. And I think that goes back to maybe the Scottish training, that you want to make a mellow, rounded, basically release that hits on all cylinders and maybe has a fruity aspect to it, has some oak, has the alcohol right in the right ratio. And that's what I think spend a lot of time doing, is just really tweaking endlessly. Sometimes it feels, to get to that balance point of any release I'm trying to put out there.
What are you experiencing friction with at the moment? I deliberately ask this question broadly.
Friction. Yeah, I think there's always sort of a push-pull between the realities of the distillery and then sort of the product development, marketing cycles of things. It's fine. I'm not saying that's friction necessarily, but it's just how to execute a project in a larger company, right? So there's so many moving pieces, from finance to marketing to then flowing all the way back down to what whiskey we're pulling out of the barrel and putting into a finishing cask, that sort of thing, that it's just a very long cycle. And I think in my background, I'm used to being fairly nimble, again, at very small companies where we could put out a new release every month, that sort of thing. I'm not saying that's the right way to tackle it, but it's sort of that friction between trying to be nimble and get new releases out and be innovative and not reactive, while still sort of maneuvering that through, a global company, so that eventually we can hopefully get these new releases on shelves in Australia or Europe, Canada, that sort of thing. Because, the mom and pop, the small craft places aren't maneuvering that. And so it's sort of trying to take both mindsets into account of how you then execute that project in a time-sensitive way, but obviously one that has global reach.
I just have one last question for you today, Owen, and that's, who would you like to hear on the show?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we obviously, when we were down in Australia, it was go, go, go. We did Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and then onwards. If I'd had more time, I would have loved to spend some time with some Australian whiskey producers. And so, I mean, I guess it goes back to like, what could I learn from cognac, or in the case of tequila, how do those things apply to what I'm doing? And in that same idea, I'd love to just kind of see what people in Australia, what the whiskey producers there are seeing on the forefront of their minds, what influences they're taking from European whiskeys or American whiskeys, and how they're putting their own spins on it. And then maybe full circle, how can I learn from that? And so no matter where we go, it doesn't have to be whiskey. I'm interested in hearing what the local producers of any, fermented or distilled beverage have to say, because those are obviously where I think I take my inspiration from, or can take my inspiration from down the line.
Amazing. I've got some episodes for you to listen to later on.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to sharing those with you. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, learning more about your career and the work that you're doing with Angels Envy now and the future. Some exciting things coming soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.